There is a photograph that almost nobody has seen. Not a formal portrait, not a staged moment in front of cameras, just a candid frame from a summer afternoon, somewhere in the late 1980s, a boy with blonde hair and his mother sitting close enough that their shoulders touch. In it, Diana is laughing at something. William is looking at her, not at the camera, not at the world outside, just at her. The way children look at the person who is their whole world before they understand what the world even is. That photograph may or may not exist in the archives, but the moment it captures, the quality of it, the texture of it, is something people who knew Diana well have described over and over again when they talk about her relationship with her eldest son. There was a particular way she had of making him feel seen, not as a future king, not as the heir, just as her boy, and it is that feeling, that specific, unrepeatable thing, that those who have observed William most closely say he has been quietly carrying inside him for more than 25 years. Diana died on August 31st, 1997. William was 15 years old. 15 is old enough to understand everything. It is also young enough that the loss carves itself into you in ways you do not fully grasp until decades later, when you are standing in front of your own child and you feel the absence of your mother as something almost physical, a hand that should be on your shoulder that is not there. People who study grief will tell you that adolescent bereavement works differently than any other kind. At 15, you are still forming the self you will carry for the rest of your life. And when the person most central to that formation disappears, the construction does not stop. It continues, but with a gap at the center where she used to be. To understand what William lost and what he has carried forward, you have to understand what Diana actually was to him, not the icon, not the people's princess, not the woman on the magazine cover. The mother who used to sneak him and Harry out of Kensington Palace for ordinary afternoons, McDonald's, theme parks, cinemas, because she was determined, in a way that alarmed the palace's more traditional advisors, that her sons would know what life outside the institution felt like. She once told a close friend, according to accounts published in multiple biographies, that the thing she feared most was raising boys who could not recognize a real human being when they saw one. Boys insulated from pain, from struggle, from the ordinary mess of being alive. She did not want that for them. She pushed against it constantly, sometimes at the cost of significant friction with the people around her. The friction was real. People who served the royal household during that period have spoken, carefully and in general terms, about the creative tension Diana brought into almost every situation involving her children's upbringing. The existing protocols for how royal children were to be raised had been in place for generations. They were not cruel protocols. They were simply ones that had evolved inside a world where emotional expression was considered, at best, a private matter, and, at worst, a form of weakness that could compromise the dignity of the institution. Diana found this suffocating. She said so, in interviews and in private conversations that people close to her have since recalled. She was not trying to undermine the monarchy. She was trying to raise two boys who would be capable of genuine human connection, and she had concluded, somewhere along the way, that genuine human connection required something the institution was not naturally inclined to provide, and so she created another world alongside the official one, a parallel life she ran for her sons, separate from the uniforms and the schedules and the formal engagements. She took them to homeless shelters in London. She sat with them in pediatric wards. She brought them into contact deliberately with people who were sick and poor and frightened, not to expose them to suffering for its own sake, but because she believed, in a way that was almost philosophical in its consistency, that empathy was not an innate quality, but a learned one, that you learned it by being near people whose lives were different from yours. that the institution, left to its own devices, would produce men who could wave from a balcony and who would never quite understand what was happening in the streets below. Those afternoons mattered, the ones where she would sit with William and listen, really listen, not half listen the way busy people do, to whatever was troubling him. Royal insiders who have spoken to journalists over the years have described Diana as someone who had an unusual capacity for undivided attention. When she focused on you, you felt it. There was nothing performative about it. That quality, those observers note, is something William himself has been seen to replicate with his own children, a way of dropping to their level, physically and emotionally, that bears an unmistakable resemblance to how his mother once dropped to his. She was also, by the accounts of people who knew her well, acutely aware of the pressures that would accumulate on William specifically as he grew older. Harry, as the second son, had a degree of freedom that the heir simply did not. William would one day be king. The weight of that was something Diana thought about seriously, not with dread, but with a kind of deliberate attention. She wanted him to arrive at that responsibility grounded in something real. She wanted him to have a core of himself that was not defined by protocol. People who were close to her during the late 1980s and early 1990s have said she spoke about this with remarkable clarity. The idea that the only way to produce a king who was genuinely good at being human was to let him be fully human first, for as long as possible. There was a conversation she had with a friend recalled in published accounts of her life, in which she talked about the difference between serving people and being present for people. She felt strongly that those were not the same thing, that you could serve someone, arrange their care, organize their support, fund their treatment, while being entirely absent from their experience, and that what people actually needed, what moved through them and changed something when they were in pain, was not service but presence. Someone who stayed in the room. Someone who did not look at their watch. William heard her say that in various forms. Over the 15 years he had with her, he saw her demonstrate it. He watched her hold hands with people who were dying at a time when the world was still afraid of what dying from AIDS meant. He watched her walk through landmine fields in Angola with a face that was completely composed, because she understood, at a level beyond the symbolic, that her presence in those places meant something different from a press release or a charity donation. He was a child watching all of this. Children absorb what they watch. They carry it forward without always knowing they are carrying it. The summer before Diana died, William was at Eton. He was 15, at the age when boys begin to differentiate themselves from their mothers, when the gravitational pull of peers and independence starts to outweigh the pull of home. By most accounts from that period, the relationship between Diana and William was in one of its more complicated phases, not fractured, never that, but adjusting. He was becoming his own person. She was navigating her own extraordinary life outside the marriage that had ended the year before. A life played out in full view of the world in ways that sometimes made things harder for her children than she intended. People close to her during that time have said she was acutely aware of this tension, that she worried about it, that she spoke about it to friends with a candor that was characteristic of her. The divorce from Charles was finalized in August 1996, about a year before her death. The years leading up to it had been, by any measure, extraordinarily difficult, not just for Diana and Charles, but for the boys who lived inside that difficulty without being old enough to fully process what was happening around them. Diana had been vocal, perhaps more vocal than was wise, about her experience inside the marriage. The Panorama interview in 1995 was the most visible expression of that, a conversation watched by tens of millions of people in which she spoke about loneliness and rejection and her own struggles with mental health and bulimia with a frankness that the palace found catastrophic and the public found depending on their perspective, either deeply sympathetic or deeply inappropriate. What is less often discussed in the retrospective coverage of that interview is what it meant for William to watch his mother on television speaking about things that were, in some ways, his family's private life. He was 13. He was at Eton. He watched it alongside other boys who also watched it. The cost of that on him is something nobody outside his closest circle can fully know. But people who have thought carefully about the intersection of Diana's public life and her son's private experience of it tend to note that the period between 1995 and 1997 was one in which William was navigating a particular kind of adolescent difficulty that had no real parallel. There was no template for what he was going through. There were no other boys at his school in quite the same situation. There was just the fact of his mother and the fact of the cameras, and the fact that those two things could never be fully separated from each other. What is publicly known, documented in multiple accounts, referenced in authorized and unauthorized biographies, acknowledged in Diana's own recorded words, is that she made her children her priority in a way that felt almost radical given the context she was operating in. She called them every day when she was traveling. She kept the routines as normal as she could manage. She was the parent who stayed up with them when they were ill, who talked to them about feelings in ways that were genuinely unusual for the world she inhabited. And then, on a Sunday morning in late August, a car crash in a Paris tunnel ended all of it. William was at Balmoral when he found out. His father told him. Charles, by most accounts, from those who were present or adjacent to that morning, handled the task with as much care as a man could under circumstances that were incomprehensible. But there is only so much a father can do in that moment. There is only so much anyone can do. William was 15, and his mother was gone, and the world outside the castle gates was already beginning to transform grief into spectacle in a way that was itself a kind of violence. What happened in the days that followed has been written about extensively. The public outpouring. The flowers outside Kensington Palace that accumulated into something that looked less like a memorial and more like a physical manifestation of collective shock. The debate inside the palace about the flag, about the protocol, about whether the royal family's visible response was adequate to the scale of public feeling. The funeral, which William and Harry walked behind, 15 and 12 years old, in suits, followed by hundreds of millions of eyes around the world. What has been said less often, though royal biographers have circled it with increasing care in recent years, is what that walk cost him. To walk behind your mother's coffin at 15, in public, with the entire world watching, that is not something you process in the moment. You cannot. The human brain is not designed for it. What you do instead, researchers who study trauma will tell you, is compartmentalize. You perform the duty because the duty is the thing you have been raised to understand as non-negotiable, and performing it gives you something to hold on to when everything else has dissolved. And then later, years later, sometimes decades, the feelings that had nowhere to go in the moment begin to surface. Earl Spencer gave a eulogy at Diana's funeral that has been quoted and analyzed many times since. In it, he spoke directly to William and Harry, addressing them as part of his remarks in a way that stepped outside the formal conventions of the occasion and into something more raw and personal. He pledged that the Spencer family would do their part to ensure that Diana's legacy lived on in her sons. Those who were in Westminster Abbey that day, and the hundreds of millions watching on television, understood what he was saying and what he was not quite saying. The applause that began outside the Abbey and spread through its walls had never happened at a royal funeral before. William sat through it at 15, with his father on one side and his grandfather on the other, holding himself together in front of the world, because that was what the moment required, and because holding yourself together when everything inside you is falling apart is something that had been modeled for him, ironically, by the very institution that had so often frustrated his mother. Some things pass through families regardless of intention. The grief that followed was, by William's own account years later, almost entirely private. He went back to Eton. He went back to the rhythms of school, the small, contained world of boys and studies and sport that had been his before the summer ended, and took everything with it. His housemaster at Eton has been described by people familiar with that period as someone who handled William's return with considerable care and discretion. The school seems to have done what it could to give him some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy, under those circumstances, was always going to be a relative term. You cannot go back to ordinary after something like that. You go forward, carrying the weight of it, learning over years and decades how to distribute that weight so it does not crush you. William has spoken about this with more directness than might have been expected. In a 2017 documentary marking the 20th anniversary of Diana's death, he and Harry both spoke about the ways in which they had suppressed their grief for years, the ways in which the culture around them had made it nearly impossible to fall apart in the way that might have helped them. William said, in words that have since been widely referenced, that he did not talk about his mother for almost 20 years, that he shut it down, that it was only later, when he began working with mental health initiatives, that he started to understand what had been sitting inside him all that time. That admission meant something. It was not a carefully managed public relations moment. The people around him at the time, mental health advocates and charity workers who collaborated with him on the Heads Together campaign, have described him as someone who arrived at those conversations with genuine personal investment, not just royal duty. The campaign encouraged people to talk about mental health openly, and those who worked on it closely have noted that his commitment to it had a quality that went beyond the professional. It was personal in a way that was visible to the people in the room with him. The specific shift, the point at which he stopped shutting it down and started opening the door to the feelings he had kept sealed, is something he has addressed in general terms without being fully specific. He has mentioned his late 20s as a period in which things began to feel more urgent, when the gap between what was sitting inside him and what he was able to express had become something he could no longer manage by simply not thinking about it. He has credited Catherine with being part of that change. He has also credited the mental health work itself, which put him in contact with people whose willingness to speak openly about their own suffering gave him a kind of permission he had not previously granted himself. And underneath it all, through all of it, was Diana. There is a particular feeling that has been referenced by multiple people close to William over the years. Not a single event, but a kind of recurring situation, a texture of grief, that he has described in different ways in different contexts. It is the feeling that arrives when something good happens, and the first instinct is to reach for the phone to tell her. The impulse before the memory, the joy before the grief that follows it. People who have lost a parent young, adults who have lost someone central to their life before the life was fully formed, they will recognize this. It is one of grief's most specific and least forgiving textures. The good news that arrives before the knowledge of the loss has time to catch up. William became a father for the first time in July 2013, when George was born. He has spoken, in careful terms, about what that moment brought with it, alongside the joy of it. The acute awareness that she was not there, that she would never meet this child, that George would never know his grandmother except through stories and photographs, and the particular quality of attention his father brings to the telling of those stories. People who observed William in the days after George's birth noted something in his face when he spoke to reporters outside the Lindo wing at St. Mary's Hospital. The happiness was genuine, and behind it, or maybe inside it, something else. Something that was not sadness exactly, but its cousin. The awareness of what was missing from a moment that was otherwise complete. People who have observed William closely during the years of his children's lives have noted something that his late mother would have recognized immediately. The way he is with them is not what royal fathers have traditionally looked like. It is warmer, more physical, more present in the sense of actually being emotionally there, not just geographically present. The photographs released over the years, official birthday portraits, casual family images, show something that reads as genuine rather than performed. There is a quality in those images of a man who actually wants to be on the floor with his children, not a man fulfilling a photographic obligation. Those who have written carefully about Diana's parenting philosophy, who have interviewed the people she confided in, the friends and advisors who watched her with William and Harry through the years she had with them, tend to note the same thing when they look at those images. That is her. That quality in him. It is something she put in him before she left, something she worked at deliberately and consistently, and it survived everything. The loss, the grief, the institution, the years of shutting it down. It came back through. It found its way forward into his children. Diana used to tell her sons, according to accounts from people she was close to, that love was not something to be rationed, that the institution they were born into had, in her view, a tendency to ration it, to keep feeling at arm's length, to treat emotional openness as a form of vulnerability rather than strength. She did not accept that. She demonstrated the alternative constantly, in small ways and large ones. She would sit on the floor with them. She would take them to hospitals and homeless shelters because she wanted them to understand from the inside what struggle felt like to the people living it. She would hug them in public at a time when such a thing was genuinely unusual for people of their station. William has spoken about the hospital visits in particular, about being taken as a child to wards and hospices, and about the way those visits lodged themselves in him. About the fact that he could not fully understand, at 7 or 8, what he was seeing, but that he retained an impression of his mother, the ease with which she sat beside people who were suffering, the way she touched them without hesitation, the quality of her attention in those rooms. That has informed the way he thinks about his own public role ever since. He has said in more than one context that watching her do that work gave him an understanding of what the role could be at its best. Not ceremony, not performance, presence. There is something that royal observers have noted about the way William handles public engagements of that kind now. He does not rush. He does not move through a receiving line with a slightly glazed quality that can descend on people doing that kind of work at high volume. Those who have been in rooms with him on those occasions tend to say there is a quality of focus to it that is unusual, that he is actually asking about you, not performing the asking. Several charity workers and mental health advocates who have met him in that context have described it in interviews with a specificity that carries weight, not general praise, but the description of a specific quality of attention they noticed and could not quite explain until they remembered whose son he is. The summer of 1997 was the last time William saw his mother. He spent part of it with her on Mohammed Al Fayed's yacht in the Mediterranean, a holiday that produced some of the last photographs taken of Diana alive, images of her tan and laughing alongside her children. It was, by most accounts, a happy time. She was navigating a life that was freer than it had been in years. Her children were with her, and the accounts of those weeks suggest she was fully present in the way she always tried to be when they were near. And then they went back to their father, and she went to Paris. William has never spoken in detail about the specific texture of that last goodbye. He has maintained a privacy around certain things that seems less like royal reserve and more like the ordinary protective instinct of someone who does not want the last private things to become public property. There is, in that silence, something entirely understandable. The things you keep because keeping them is the only way to keep them whole. What he has spoken about is the way he has tried to continue things she began. The landmine campaign, which Diana championed in the final years of her life, and which contributed to real policy change through her advocacy in Angola and Bosnia, is something William has referenced. The charitable work around HIV and AIDS, which Diana approached at a moment when the stigma was extreme, is something he has acknowledged as formative. He has spoken about watching her walk into those hospital wards without protective gloves at a time when many people were afraid to shake hands with AIDS patients, and about the way that image has never left him. There is something that those who study the psychology of parental loss in high-performing individuals tend to observe. When the lost parent modeled something rare and valuable, grief often carries an unusual quality, not just sadness, but a sense of responsibility, a feeling of carrying something forward that cannot be set down, that the only way to honor what was lost is to become, in some way, a continuation of it. Those who have observed William most closely over the years say that this is visible in him, not in a performed way, not as a public statement, but in the choices, in the causes he gravitates toward, in the way he is with his children, in the particular quality of attention he brings to conversations about suffering, about mental health, about what it costs to carry pain in private. He knows that cost personally. Catherine, the Princess of Wales, has spoken in interviews about the way William talks about his mother, the way Diana comes up naturally in their family, not as a formal memorial exercise, but as an ordinary part of conversation. The children know their grandmother through photographs, stories, the people who loved her. Royal commentators who have observed the family over many years have noted that there is something deliberate about this, that William and Catherine have made a conscious choice to keep Diana present in a way that is warm rather than weighted. George, Charlotte, and Louis have been photographed wearing items that belong to Diana. The sapphire ring on Catherine's finger is Diana's, the one Charles gave Diana when they became engaged, which was in a box when Diana died and which William held onto for years before the moment arrived when he knew what to do with it. He has spoken about why he gave it to Catherine, about wanting his mother to be part of his marriage in some way, to be present in a moment she did not live to see. There is something about that choice that says more than most things William has ever said in formal interviews. It is the action of someone who has been trying for his entire adult life to keep her close in the ways that remain available to him. Through his work, through the way he parents, through the stories he tells his children about the grandmother they never met, through the ring that catches the light at public events in a way that is never entirely accidental when you understand why it is there. The moment with Diana that William carries with him is not one moment. It is thousands of them, accumulated over 15 years, compressed by the loss into something that functions less like individual memories and more like a foundation. The afternoons at the theme park and the hospital wards and the floor of Kensington Palace, the phone calls from wherever she was in the world, the way she looked at him, the way she listened, the way she made him feel before he was old enough to understand that this was not something he could take for granted, that he was worth looking at, worth listening to, worth the full and undivided attention of the person he loved most. That feeling of being truly seen by the person whose seeing mattered most to you is something that people who have had it and lost it tend to spend the rest of their lives looking for ways to give to others. Because once you have known what it feels like to be fully attended to, you cannot unfeel it. And once the person who gave it to you is gone, the closest thing to having it again is offering it yourself. To your children, to the people who sit across from you at charity events and hospital visits, to the boy in the school corridor who says something and finds a man crouching down to actually hear it. He lost her at 15. He has been carrying her for more than 25 years. And the caring, those who know him say, has made him into something she would have recognized. something she was trying, in every way she knew how, to help him become, not a king in the institution's image alone. A man who can sit with someone in pain and not look away. A father who gets on the floor. A person who shows up with his full attention in rooms where it matters. She gave him that. Whatever else the years between them and the years since have contained, she gave him that. And he has not put it down. That is the moment. That is the one he carries. Not a single afternoon. Not a single conversation. Not one image from a photograph that almost nobody has seen. But the cumulative weight of a mother who decided, every day she had with him, that love was the most important thing she could pass on. He got it. He is still holding it. And perhaps that is what matters most in the end. Not the titles or the protocols or the weight of what he will one day become by virtue of birth. What matters is this. A 15-year-old boy learned from a woman who had every reason to harden and did not, that the most radical thing a person in his position could do was refuse to disappear behind the role. That the institution was there to serve people, not to be served by them. That the hands you hold in a hospital room, and the ear you offer to a struggling child, and the tears you do not hide when your own grief becomes too heavy to conceal in public, these are not weaknesses. They are the point. They were always the point. Diana understood this before anyone around her had the language for it. She was operating on instinct, on something she felt rather than theorized, and she was often penalized for it, but she passed it forward. To two boys who were watching her more carefully than she perhaps knew, absorbing more than she intended to transmit, carrying into their adult lives a set of values that were hers, and that she planted in them with every afternoon outside the palace walls, every hospital visit, every moment of genuine attention, given freely and without ceremony. William is in his 40s now. He has been a husband for more than a decade. He is the father of 3 children who will one day carry forward whatever he has built in them, the way he carries forward what she built in him. The line moves through time. The love, when it is real, and hers was, does not stop when the person who gave it dies. It finds new form. It moves through people. It reappears in a crouched figure in a school corridor, or in a public conversation about mental health, or in the way a father speaks to his daughter about the grandmother she never met. It shows up in small, specific, unremarkable moments that are, if you pay attention to them correctly, the most remarkable thing of all. She gave him 15 years. He has given them back to the world, slowly, in the way she taught him to.